This is an article by Rabbi J. Kelman on something called TorahInMotion.org. And he is focused on Daf Yomi from the tractate Kritot, which talks about things that, this is Daf Yud Gimel, page 13, that talks about things that you would be liable for koret, which is a heavenly death penalty. And so, Jewish tradition teaches that we are to celebrate joyous occasions, Shabbos and Yom Tov, Bris Milah, a wedding, by drinking wine. Used appropriately, wine gladdens the heart of man, as it says in Tehillim. Used inappropriately, wine can literally kill. Drink no wine or other intoxicant, you or your sons, when you enter the tent of meeting, that you may not die. This is a law for all time throughout the ages. Vayikra 10:9. This verse follows immediately after the death of Nadav and Avihu, who were Aaron's sons, led many commentaries to link their death to their having drunk wine before entering the inner sanctum. It does not take much to put one's life at risk. The Talmud in Kritot 13b rules that a Kohen who drinks as little as a revid of wine, approximately 3.3 ounces. I rounded it off to 4 because it's just easier, because a log, a log is approximately a pint is 16 ounces. So a log is approximately a pint, a quarter of that is approximately 4. So it's everywhere. 3.3 is a smaller, there's like a scale of what it could be. I typically say 4 ounces, but 3.3 halachically is the amount that most people rest on. And then performs his temple service, is liable to a penalty of death at the hands of heaven. So this is what we read in the Rambam. A level of sin surpassed only by those carrying the death penalty or karet. It may take a few ounces to get one killed, but a Kohen who performs avodah service in the temple, having drunk even lesser amounts of alcohol, would be in violation of this biblical injunction. Okay. Albeit one that is punishable only by lashes. So he is saying here that even if a Kohen even drinks less, he's still in violation, but he would not get the heavenly death penalty. It is this fear that a Kohen may have had something to drink that explains why Birkat Kohanim is not recited in the Shmona Esrei of Mincha, unless it's a fast day. So again, we spoke about that yesterday. I mentioned that in Israel, where they do the Kohen blessing every day as part of the repetition of the Amidah, they don't do it for Mincha. Why don't they do it for Mincha? Because the concern is that some of the Kohanim may have had some wine during the day before Mincha, and Birkat Kohanim is a kind of service of the Kohanim, and they're not allowed to drink beforehand. So therefore, the custom is not to do Birkat Kohanim at the Mincha service unless it's a fast day, because then on a fast day, you don't have to worry about that. Consumption of even the smallest amounts of alcohol has an impact on us and must not be had when important work is to be done. But one need not be a Kohen to run afoul of this prohibition. After warning against entry to the Ohel Moed, or later the Beit HaMikdash, under the influence, the Ohel Moed is usually translated as tent of meeting, which usually means the Mishkan, the tabernacle. or later the Beit HaMikdash, under the influence of any intoxicating substance. The Torah continues, for you must distinguish between the sacred and the profane, between the impure and the pure, and you must instruct Israelites all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hands of Moshe. Exegetically commenting on these verses, which means halachic midrash, our sages understand them to apply to any decision-making that requires thinking skills. That's how this is how he's defining that word that we saw in the translation of the Rambam, lehorot, which usually means like halachic decision-making. And that you may differentiate it between the sacred and the profane. Prohibits decisions on laws of values and valuation, dedications and consecrations. Between the impure and the pure, prohibits decisions on the laws of ritually impure and ritually pure. And you must not instruct, prohibits decisions on the laws of what is prohibited, permitted or prohibited. All these statutes prohibits decisions on the laws of halachic expositions of the Torah, which the Lord has spoken, prohibits decisions on the laws of halacha transmitted orally to Moshe from Sinai by the hands of Moshe is referring to the Talmud. So they did not have the Talmud initially. What they mean is the laws that arise using the methodology of the Talmud. So it doesn't matter if it's written law, if it's oral law, it doesn't matter if it's oral law in an early state or oral law in a state developed through discussion and debate, etc. Any decision-making under the influence of alcohol is forbidden. The Gemara relates that Rav Acha from Huzal took a vow forbidding himself to benefit from his wife. As was to be expected, he soon regretted his decision and approached Rav Ashi to annul his vow. He could do so by asking a series of questions to determine whether Rav Acha fully appreciated the consequence of his vow, or if he truly regretted making such a vow. So there is a rule when you make a neder, when you make a vow, that, I mean, the Torah says you have to keep it. But we have an out. One out, the main out, is to go to a Beit Din or to one Chacham to explain why you regret making it, and then he can annul the vow. So typically this involves going to the person, telling him what vow you made, under what circumstances you made the vow, and then he asks you all sorts of questions to determine that. Essentially what he has to determine is if you understood the ramifications of this vow, you would have never made it. So, but he has to ask questions. He has to come to some kinds of determinations before he annuls the vow. Rav Acha fully appreciated the consequence of his vow to see if he truly regretted it. However, Rav Ashi told him, go away today and come back tomorrow, as Rav did not have an Amora explain his lectures until after Yom Tov. All right, so this is to be expected. He soon regretted his decision and approached Rav Ashi. He must mean the Rav did not have an Amora explain his lectures until the. I see what the problem is. This, for the same reason that Rav did not have an Amora explain his lectures until the day after Yom Tov. So Rav famously did not either give a lecture or have an Amora. The Amora is a kind of, we'll call him a TA. He's like a TA. The teacher would teach, and this person, the Amora, would either the teacher would teach in a soft voice. He would say it loudly for everybody to hear, but also he would explain sometimes what the teacher is teaching to the students who were gathered. Sometimes they'd be large gatherings and they really needed somebody to shout, or sometimes he's also interpreting. That's that word Amora is the word that we use to speak about the scholars of the time of the Gemara. So why didn't Rav have an Amora shout out and explain his teachings until the day after Yom Tov? Because on Yom Tov, everybody had drunk wine. And so apparently he wanted a day for people to get over the wine drinking before he taught Torah. And apparently that's what Rav Ashi is explaining to him. He needs a day because he drank wine, and he can't do this until he's moved past the experience. Now here it sounds like a day after drinking wine until somebody can make halachic decision making. Under normal circumstances, this would be a terrible thing to do. In a frightening comment, the Mechilta records that as Rebbe Shimon and Rebbe Yishmael, the first of the Asara Haruge Malchus, the 10 martyrs murdered by the Romans, were being led to their deaths, Rebbe Shimon turned to Rebbe Yishmael lamenting, "My heart goes out as I do not know why I'm being killed." Rebbe Yishmael answered, "Did it never happen that a person came to you with a question and you told them to wait until you finished your drink, or tied your shoes, or put on your shirt? The Torah says, Im anetane, if you afflict, whether a little affliction or a lot of affliction." He said to him, "My teacher, you have comforted me." So this is a halachic midrash, and so this is Reb Shimon ben Gamliel and Reb Yishmael. And Reb Shimon he couldn't think of what he had done that made sense of the fact that he's about to be killed. Because they made the assumption that besides the global issues involved in what was going on, that they were being killed by the Romans as Torah scholars. There was something in their personal narrative where this made sense. In other words, being killed was an appropriate experience for them moving forward. And he couldn't figure out why. And Rabbi Shmuel said to him, delaying when people are asking you a halachic question, delaying in the answer is already a sufficient reason to be killed. Now, he says, "You have comforted me." So I'm assuming in this context that what he means is he can see his impending execution as part of his path forward. Clearly, they understood that this life experience is a temporary one, and you're going to move afterwards. And so everything that happens in life is meaningful as part of this life path. And he's trying to figure out how this is meaningful in his life path. So, and once he understood it and it made sense to him, he could move forward. These were not normal circumstances. Rav Ashi had consumed some wine and thus was incapable of making a totally clear-headed decision. Following in the footsteps of Rav, who after having consumed wine in honor of a festival didn't teach on Yom Tov, waiting a full day before resuming his teaching, Rav Ashi told Rav Acha to come back the next day. So even though it's a serious thing to delay answering a halachic question, he clearly he had a tradition going back to Rav. Rav Ashi is the redactor of the Talmud, so he's like fifth generation Amora in Bavel. Rav is first generation, so first generation meant that Rav lived in the middle to end of the 200s of the Common Era. Rav Ashi is closer to 450, so there's a couple hundred years between Rav and Rav Ashi's. This was clearly a tradition handed down from teacher to student for several hundred years. That notice that Rav is teaching. Rav Ashi is making a halachic decision, but Rav Ashi understood that they were the same, and that so you need to research a little bit more about exactly what it is that you can't teach in violation of this. One must be exacting in determining when we must and when we mustn't issue halachic rulings. Someone's life may depend on it. Okay, so the main thing was, the clearest thing is that just want to get here, let's see. Is that you can't make halachic decisions under the influence. In our last post, we discussed the serious prohibition of issuing halachic rulings after having had even minimal amounts of alcohol. Yet the practical impact of this prohibition is rather limited. Is it possible in the teaching of the Mishnah is also forbidden? To this seemingly strange question, why would you think that teaching a Mishnah after having a drink is allowed? The Gemara says there is no such problem. It is hora'ah, practical rulings of Jewish law, that one may not issue after having a drink. But Mishnah may not be relied upon for practical rulings. In other words, by Mishnah alone, just studying Mishnah, you're not allowed to come to a halachic ruling. You need to study the Talmud related to it, and then you would need nowadays to go through the various halachic texts that are relied upon before coming to a halachic decision. Just reading the Mishnah, which is the very first outline of the oral law, doesn't give you enough information, and therefore studying or teaching Mishnah is not a violation. You could be drunk and teach Mishnah and you would not violate it. It is the basis of Jewish law, the ground floor that serves as the foundation of Jewish law. Yet before we issue a practical ruling, we must complete the structure. Thus, one who has consumed relatively small amounts of alcohol may teach Mishnah. Rav Yossi goes even further and includes Talmud matters that are not considered hara and may be taught even if one has had a revit of wine. being able to analyze all of the Talmudic literature does not necessarily give one license to issue practical halachic rulings. So because studying Mishnah and Talmud alone does not yet give you enough information to come to a halachic ruling, it was not considered forbidden to study or teach these after having the forbidden amount of wine. Yet even matters of practical halacha may often be taught after having a small amount to drink. One who has drunk wine may rule that a creeping animal is ritually impure and a frog is pure. This may be a very practical ruling, at least in temple times it was, because it requires no analysis, no weighing of options, and no examination of conflicting views before answering. All it takes is for one to go and read what it says in the Torah. The Torah very clearly lists the 8 rodents that convey impurity. A little bit of wine will have little impact on issuing such a ruling. So since this does not require reasoning, it does not require the ability to make distinctions, but it's rather just reading off a list, it is not considered to be one of those things that you cannot teach after drinking wine. Truth be told, the vast majority of halachic questions asked do not fall under the category of hora. They are what we might call mare makom, pointing out the place where the ruling has been issued. So we talked yesterday, I was talking about these different standards of smicha. So the first level is called yora, which is the permission to lahorot, to do hora. Again, hora means you're answering a question that requires applying reason and making distinctions. But if somebody asks you a question and the answer is explicit in the Torah, or the answer is written explicitly in a text, in any text, if somebody asks you a question and it's written explicitly in a text, so for instance, let's say somebody says, am I allowed to walk my dog holding a leash in a place that has an eruv on Shabbos? So I was once sitting with Rav Scheinberg, Rav Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg, of blessed memory, in Israel, and somebody, when I was sitting there, somebody asked him this question, and he responded that in this book, Shmir Shabbos Kehilchasa, he says such and such. Now, that there's even, it gets broader, even if there's not an eruv, am I allowed to do it? So anyways, but it's fully discussed in this book. He just cited a location. He said, in this book, it says such and such. So according to what he's saying right over here, that is not hora. Again, that is not one of the things you would be forbidden to do if you drink wine. It's also like, let's say somebody doesn't have smicha. He never got permission, he or she never got permission to decide Jewish law. And somebody is not sure, and they come up to that person. Like, there's certain things where, like, I have a running joke ever since Rabbi Fox came and became the rabbi at Darchei Noam. So it's a running joke, but it's a serious running joke. But the running joke is, if somebody comes up to me and asks me a question, I respond, all practical halachic questions must be asked to Rabbi Daniel Fox. I only answer theoretical questions. But that distinction, in other words, there are certain questions that need a rabbi. For all questions that need a rabbi, he's the rabbi. If you're asking me a question that doesn't need a rabbi, then I'm happy to help you. I felt it was important that people understand what his role is in the shul, and not confuse between us, because I have this confusing role of being. My role was always confusing at the shul, and it's even somewhat more confusing to people at the outset. And so that was important to me to make that distinction. Any question that needs to be asked of a rabbi, he's the guy. I'm not the guy. And so, but he's making an even tighter distinction. He's saying it could even be a practical halacha question, but if you could just send somebody to a book that writes about it, and they're actually getting the halachic information from the book, not from you, then that is not hora. And so in my case, there is no halachic mistake that they would be making necessarily by asking me. It's more of a practical issue about how the shul gets run. But there is an area where it would actually be a practical halachic interest, and that's if somebody had a drink. So if somebody had a drink of wine, so let's say after Kiddush on Shabbos, where Rabbi Fox has already drank, he drank the wine from Kiddush. So now if they have a practical halachic question, he can't answer them. But if he can say it, that in such a, either go look at such and such a book, or he could say in such and such a book, it says, then he's not in violation of the prohibition.
May I'm just unclear on something. It seems implicitly that he is giving an opinion. He's giving information, but he selected the source. There may be an opposing source that rules differently, but he didn't mention the source. So he was very selective in what he did, and that implicitly is making a decision.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're making a good point. I mean, these kind of places, like when he was sending this person to Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, that work is a very respected, highly followed work. But you are right that even so, knowing that Rav Scheinberg would follow the rulings of that book in the same way that a lay person would, is already interesting. It was interesting to me at the time. I used to repeat it as a sort of matter of interest amongst my friends, that he would say something like that. It says in the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa. And also, he once did that to me. We've talked about it before, when Rav Moshe Feinstein ruled on wills of today, that the wills of today have halachic standing, even though it sounds like the inheritance is only determined after the person died from a will. But he said it's actually being determined before the person died, and therefore, even though he's giving the gift to somebody who's not in the normal line of inheritance, the gift is still a gift. And so Rav Moshe Feinstein had written this in a responsa. When he first wrote in a responsa, there was a book called Jewish Law of Inheritance, and in that book he said, Rav Moshe wrote this, but it's just hard for me to believe it's going to be generally accepted. Then a few decades later, I asked Rav Scheinberg about that, about a case. It was an actual case where my mother was left something from her parents, and she has a brother. Now, technically, according to the halacha of inheritance, it all should go to the brother. And if my mother took it without her brothers giving it to her, It could be theft, a form of theft. So I asked Rav Scheinberg about it, and Rav Scheinberg goes, Rav Moshe already paskin that it's that the wills are they have a logic standing. So as you're pointing out, even though he's citing halacha from a written source, but there still is a decision-making aspect. The only thing, the one thought that comes to mind is what the person is saying to you is, I'm sending you to this work. You're getting your halachic decision-making from this work. You're not getting it from me. In other words, I'm not going to have to think this through. In other words, I'm not doing halachic reasoning that's leading to a conclusion. It's all there in that work. All he's saying is you can rely on him. In other words, that apparent, it might be something subtle like that what he's doing is sending you over there and you're getting the halachic reasoning from the work. You're not getting his halachic reasoning on this thing. It is true that by sending you there, he is making a halachic decision, but I could see how that kind of halachic decision is not the same, but I hear it. I hear it. It's a good question. All right.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
it would be pretty funny if he sent you to the work and the answer wasn't in there and he says, oh, I was drunk when I sent you to that work. Never mind.
Yeah, that would be funny. Who told you to look over there? You did. I was drunk. Why would you rely on me? Yeah, that was funny.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Now they aren't even talking about people that are drunk, because the issue of a posek being drunk may involve other halachic issues as well, that it might be unseemly, a lack of dignity. It might impact people's awe of Torah and stuff like that. But this is, of course, he's supposed to say kiddush and have moderate drinking. There might be a different question if he's really drunk. That depends on culture. In some communities, it's more appropriate than others. Moshe Shapiro did not like the idea of being drunk to the point where you act inappropriate. By inappropriate, I mean undignified. He did not like it. He tried to send that message on Purim, because he would teach us on Purim, and he did not. He made it clear that he did not think that wild behavior was the ideal. But again, knowing that line between what is the goal of Purim and what is considered wild, you even have Gemaras that sound like some people were wild on Purim. Quoting the authoritative rulings of others is a matter of possessing a certain level of knowledge, not a matter of hora'ah. Issuing rulings in cases where one can't remember if they daven mincha, if some milk fell into chicken soup, or if one must get tzedakah on wedding gifts, is a little more than passing on information that has been ruled upon in Jewish law. Encyclopedic knowledge of Jewish law does not make one a posek. It makes one a scholar and one from whom there's much to learn. Hora, halachic rulings, are rulings regarding new cases, involve innovative thinking, and often have meager sources to help guide the posek. To answer these questions, one's mind must be fully focused and then some. One must possess not only great Torah learning, but an understanding of the surrounding society and culture. Practical halachic rulings are often complex and highly nuanced. where the smallest of factors may play an important role in the bottom line ruling. And often, it is not technical halachic factors that have the greatest influence on the correct ruling. Broader issues such as monetary considerations, social norms, the impact on others, and communal policy are just some of the factors that often play an important role in Hora. Weighing all these factors, while firmly rooted in traditional texts, requires tremendous intellectual focus and ability. Even the slightest impairment can have serious repercussions, and thus, even small amounts of alcohol may not be consumed. One who's had a cup of wine can teach much of Torah. A Torah class is much different from a halachic ruling, much as we distinguish between a lecture of law and a ruling of a judge. It is not only small amounts of liquor that can distort the truth. It is not only small amounts of liquor that can distort the truth, even if ever so slightly. This past Shabbos, we read the Torah prohibition for a judge to take a bribe. Even the smallest of gifts can serve as a bribe. The Talmud in Ksubas records sages who recused himself from cases where one of the litigants gave so much as a warm greeting or offered a hand to hold as they crossed a bridge or wiped some dirt off a potential judge's clothes. These rabbis understood they were influenced by the smallest things, and even if we're aware of these influences, there's little we can do to combat them. A judge must have a zero tolerance policy in many areas. Our sages heap praise on those who issue proper halachic rulings. Rabbi Yonason said, all judges who issue a true ruling to its own truth, din emet la'amito, cause the divine presence to dwell in Israel. The double use of the word emet emphasizes both the difficulty and importance of issuing proper rulings. Sometimes things can be true in halachic theory, but not true in practice, emet la'amito. The signature of God is truth, which is chotama shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu emet, but only a man applying halachic theory to the world reality can make it emet la'amito. So again, his emphasis here is that when we come down to the final practice impacted by this law, it is making a decision, making a halachic decision that requires you to work it out. You actually have to work it out in that moment in order to come to that halachic decision, which means applying reason, being able to make distinctions, collect all the data, etc. And that you cannot do, you're not supposed to do even after drinking just a little bit of wine. And that's where this prohibition really lies. And David made a good point about the Urim, but he is suggesting certainly teaching Torah that doesn't have a present halachic application, that would not be forbidden. And if somebody asks a halachic question, but you can refer them to something like a list or a source that has the halachic decision, he was saying that you would be allowed to do that, but there is, David made a good point over there. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to learn together. Be well.